So I've decided to break the Turbulence FD portion into two parts. This way we'll get the most control and be able to tweak both our dust elements separately. So let's give this a go. Okay, so what we need to do is jump out of our camera view, and another thing you probably want to do under the render settings, just make sure you're in the standard renderer and turn off ambient occlusion and global illumination. We're not going to need that. So there's going to be a lot of turning things on and off in this and testing and stuff, so I'll try not to go too fast. We'll turn off this camera visibility here, we don't need that. Anything that's sort of distracting to the scene we want to get rid of. Alright, so let's go up to plugins and get a Turbulence FD container. And what you want to do is scrub through your animation till it's completed, and we want to scale this container up so that we just encompass the area of the broken pieces. So we'll drag it out. If we go into our front view here, we can see how wide we need it. Our side view here. Just want to try and keep this thing as tight as possible. And for the actual height of this, I'm not really sure how high I want to have it at this stage. You want to have it a little bit above the ground, but not too much, and maybe have it, half to 3/4 of the way down to begin with, and you can see if it's, if the clipping's gonna, impact your simulation and ruin it. Again, like I spoke about with global illumination, things that are simulated like this and take a lot of GPU or CPU power, you just want to see what you can get away with, and if you can't notice it in the render, there's no point, overcompensating for it. So you just want to sort of run some tests and see what looks good, really. So that looks like it's going to suit our needs. Might just bring it up a bit more. Alright, so our grid looks pretty good. For the voxel size, initially you probably want to set it at 5, something high, so it's just really low resolution. Coming down here, we can see that we've got cache temperature on by default. We'll also probably look at density. We might not do that in this particular element though. We'll just see how we go. And we want to add a new cache, so just click new and obviously put in a path for where you want to save that data. Before we start too, we want to view our density channel, I'd say at this point. For rendering, we'll come into fire shader, turn that to none, and the smoke shader mapping, we'll set that to density. And if we just click in this box here, click on this first knot and type in 0.001. It's just something I like to do with the smoke rendering, just to give us a little bit of a speed increase. Thickness at 15 should be good. And for the smoke color, let's just double click this and color pick one of the colors from our scene. Should work well. So I think most stuff there looks pretty good. Under simulation, we want to come down and check on density. And under temperature, this buoyancy here, we even want to set that to maybe about 5 to start with. So we can see now back in our container settings that this density option now is checked. So we'll just give this a run to start with. Now we need something to emit from. So this first element is actually going to come in from the borders of the hole and sort of come inwards, and it will get dragged down with the pieces. So to do this, we need to grab a selection. So what we need to do is turn off our pieces. As I said, there will be a lot of turning things on and off, so it can get a little bit confusing. If we get our hole, what we need to do is go into poly mode. Actually, it's probably going to work a lot better if we do this on our top. So I've already got this selected. Obviously that's what I used last time, so yeah, just ignore that part about the hole. We're going to get this selection from the top. So if we deselect this, we can see if we come up to ring selection, I think it is, we can get this piece here and hold down shift and grab this piece. Okay, now what we can do is use the split command, and it's going to make a duplicate. The duplicate that we want is always the bottom copy, so let's just drag that down, and we'll rename this edge emit or something, you know, that makes sense, like that. And we can just drag this up to test we've got the right piece, and we do. So what we can do now is get rid of all this stuff here. Don't need it, and we can probably turn this top off for now. So what I've brought in here is our emission texture that I've created. Now I've done this in advance because it's being covered well, by me anyway, in my 9th tutorial about the burn shader, and I thought there's so much in this to cover that I didn't want to waste any more time going over simple stuff like this when you can get that information elsewhere, and we can get on with all the good stuff here. So if we just twirl this down, we can just scrub through. I've got some keyframes here, and it's just a gradient map animated. That's all it is. Alright, so what we want to do is drag that onto our edge emit, and we can select it here, select our texture tool here, and it's got projection as spherical. We need that to be flat, and we want to turn that 90 degrees in the H, like that. And then what we can do is stretch it out in X. We just want to make it really long, and then we can move it. Make sure you turn on this axis tool again. Let's keep stretching it out. If we scrub through, we can see it passing over our edge. Now what we want to achieve is to time this up with our plane effectors that come through and break our pieces. So we can just have a look at this. So it needs to come forward a lot more, and it's not reaching the end, so we just need to keep scaling it until it gets so it gets like it's covering the whole piece from start to finish. That looks pretty good to me. Now what we'll need to do quickly is drag our first plane effector out of our backup null here and just switch it on, because this is what we're going to use to time this up. Okay, so it's lagging behind quite a bit. So the best way to edit the keyframes on this texture, I find anyway, is hold down shift and press F3. That'll open up the timeline, and we can see our gradient just here. Okay, and if we hit H on the keyboard, it'll give us the selection of all the keyframes. So it's just this start one and this end one here we want to shift along. So we should be able to shrink this down a little bit, and this first one could start a little bit earlier. This doesn't have to be perfect, just get it close, and the end one, bring it back. That looks like it's pretty accurate for now, so let's just go with that. We can just minimize this, and we'll turn off that plane effector for now. Turn off axis mode, go back to object mode or model mode here. And we can see our animated texture. Okay, so now what we want to do is add a TFD emitter tag to that object there. So let's just right click, go turbulence FD and choose the emitter tag. We want to turn off fill object, put the radius up to about 3, and we want to choose this surface texture channel luminance, and we want to put probably 3 in the temperature and 3 in density, and just set them to add. And pressure, we could try 1. These are just all ballpark to begin with, just so we can get our simulation going. Another thing I want to do on this texture too is right click it and generate UVW coordinates. Now if I didn't do that, turbulence wouldn't be able to read that mapping. So if we want to go back and adjust that later, just delete this tag off. That'll go back to flat mapping, adjust it again, right click and generate new coordinates. Okay. So if we play this through, hopefully we'll get something. You can simulate turbulence FD with your CPU or GPU. If you have a good graphics card, it's so much faster, like ridiculously faster. So that's obviously a good recommended thing when you're using turbulence FD, because you can really take advantage of that speed. So you know, I do have a decent card. It's not the best one, but it's pretty good. And it's got 4 gigs of memory, so that's going to help out heaps here. So I'm going to use that. So we'll just hit the start button. And that's pretty much what we need for a start. We can see it passing through, and it is being emitted from the texture. So that is a good start. So at this stage you can probably turn back on the pieces to visualize this a bit better. And we want to turn back the top and just make sure that our edge emit isn't renderable. There's always like a lot of testing when you're doing stuff like this with simulations. So we can see like it's rising up quite a bit. We want to make that not so much. So under the simulation tab, we can get our buoyancy and just turn that down to 1 or even 0.5. We don't need it to have buoyancy really. Well, not much anyway. We can add some vorticity. We'll go 4, and turbulence. We'll go 4 on that too. We'll give that a try. We can do a quick render. And resolution's super low at the moment too, so you can see that it's clipping on the top of our grid. So if we go to our side view, we probably want to enlarge that a little bit more. So go to our container, drag that up, probably more like that, a bit less. Just see how that goes. So you just want to keep an eye on your grid from all different views. We can increase the resolution a bit, drop it down to 4. Every time you do increase the resolution to, everything is going to be more compact and smaller. So that's just something to bear in mind. Okay, so it's not too bad. The good thing is we've got the emission texture and everything set up now, so it's really good for going in and doing all your tweaks. You can come into the simulation tab, play around with your turbulences and your vorticity, all that sort of stuff, the temperature and density. You can have a lot of fun with this now and sort of shape it the way you want. Add gravity if you want to. We can try that just to give it a test. But the core of it is set up. It's really quite easy. So we can now see that it's not rising up really at all. It's just sinking into the hole. It's probably not the best setup for this particular element. We'll do that with our second one. But I just wanted to show that you can get a nice quick setup done and then go in and make some little tweaks and get really varied results. So I don't really like gravity on this particular element at all, but it's definitely an option if you want. One key important thing that I haven't got happening here is any collision with the pieces, so let's just add that in. So on our pieces here, which is our main fracture, let's right click and go turbulence FD emitter, and all we need to do on this one is check the collision object. So you'll see now this is going to change it quite a bit. It will slow it down, of course, there's a lot more calculations going on, but this should actually drag the pieces into the hole a lot better. The thing that I love about Turbulence FD is it is really easy to work with. That's looking much better. Looks great. Okay. So if we just scrub through that, again, it's very low res at this stage, but it's a good starting point. I'd say for our first element that's really all we need to do at this stage. Before you render this though, of course pay attention to your grid resolution. If you come into the container here, if we pull this down to maybe 2, you want to make sure that this is close to at least a couple hundred in every axis. That way you'll get really good detail. So I'd go maybe at least 1.2 or something like that. It's going to take a while, but keep an eye on this too. With my final one, I couldn't actually simulate it on the GPU because it was going to use too much memory and it would have just crashed. So I had to switch to CPU and just went and had a coffee and come back and it was done. So just get this resolution up for your final render, and you should be good to go with that. Just want to show something here too with the rendering of this. Say we pick this frame, we come up here, this is how I'd suggest you render this out. So what you want to do is use multipass, and the two passes that you want is the atmosphere and the atmosphere multiply, and I'll just quickly show you why. So if we go current frame, of course don't forget to set your paths. You won't need this top one here, just the bottom, but you'll need this checked. And you can render this in whatever you want. It's suggested that you render Turbulence FD in 32 bits per channel, so probably like a 32-bit TIFF or OpenEXR. With smoke, I tend to just go 16-bit PNGs, but with fire, I'd definitely recommend 32-bit, so you get all those real high brightness values and stuff. In the previous chapters when we rendered just the geometry, I did forget to tell you, set this image color profile to linear, and you want to do this for the Turbulence FD as well. So just remember, if you're rendering the stuff from the past chapter, if you haven't already done it, I'll probably put a little note in there anyway. Just change this to linear. Okay, so when we go into After Effects, we can keep that full linear workflow, and everything will turn out really good. So like I said, 16-bit PNGs is probably alright for this, but totally up to you. So what I'll do though is quickly render out a frame with these passes on, and we'll just have a look at something. So let's just for testing go 960 by 540 and render this. It shouldn't take too long. If we come over into our layer tab here, we can click on our single passes. Alright, so it's not really a great example. The smoke's not that dense at this stage, but you'll get the point here. So the way the smoke looks now in this picture viewer is of course the way that you want it to look in your in your post and when you're compositing and all that stuff. So what you're going to need to do is usually when you render out fire, you'll just render the atmosphere pass, but when you're going to do smoke, you want to render the multiply pass as well. That way when this is set to add and this is set to multiply in your composition in After Effects or whatever package you're using, they'll blend together and make this final look here, which will have that nice body to it, and it won't look real transparent and sort of weak. So that's just something to note there. But yeah, it's just something that can catch you out if you've never rendered smoke out of Turbulence FD before. But yeah, so I just wanted to quickly go over that and talk about that. So as I said, that's what you want to do for rendering. Just make sure again that it is the standard renderer, or you might get some weird artifacts or flickering, but we're not using this to render any geometry, it's just to render the atmospherics. So now what we'll do is save this off as maybe Turbulence FD Part 1 and have a look at our second element that we're going to make. Okay, so for the second element, I thought a good place to emit from might be the actual bottom of the broken pieces, so we get some sort of volume of dust in the actual hole. So we need to get rid of this sim now, we don't need it. So we can just delete that cache or do a new one or whatever you want. I don't really need it, but I'll keep it there just for the sake of it. Alright, so our containers are pretty much set up at this stage, which is good. It's pretty deep. You could probably have it a bit more shallow than that, but actually let's do that. Probably just a waste. Remember, the smaller your grid is, the easier it's going to be to get more resolution into it. And we don't really need it up that high. So we can be a bit more conservative with this one. We'll go for that. Alright, so now we need to set up the emission pieces. So we can turn off the visibility in the viewport as well for edge emit. And what we want to do is make a copy of our pieces. So just control drag down a copy. And remember earlier when we made this bottom selection, that's where we're going to use this. So we'll get rid of everything else. Don't get rid of the normal tag and the point cache, but the textures and the UVW coordinates can go. We'll get rid of the TFD tag because that was for collisions on these original pieces, and we'll just turn the originals off for now. Don't really need to see them, and turn off the top. So we'll just call this one pieces emit. So all we've really got on here is our bottom faces selection tag. We're going to need to turn off the hole as well so we can see that we actually are emitting something. Alright, so what we can probably do now is get this texture tag from the edge emit, control drag it on, and go in and set the projection to flat. Now if we scrub this, we should have the exact same sort of emission as what we had before we generated the UV coordinates on this back in the previous lesson. So that looks like it's the case, which is really, really good. So if we're to use this at the moment, it's going to emit across all these faces. So we don't want that. We just want it to come off the bottom and sort of go into the base of the hole. So that's pretty easy to set up. We just need a TFD emission tag. We need to turn off fill object again. We'll set this to about 5 on the radius. That's just going to make almost like the emission source larger. So it can be handy if you're trying to fill in large spaces and stuff like that. Think of it as kind of like a particle size, I guess. It's probably not the exact right way to think of it, but it might help you sort of visualize what I'm talking about. We can go density. We're not going to need temperature on this one, so let's just go 5 in density, set it to add, and we can probably do a little bit of pressure, maybe 1 or something. All these you can just play with anyway. You're not going to really ruin anything too badly if you start to tweak these and start with small values. That's how I learned how to do it anyway. It's a good thing to sort of get your feet wet with. Alright, so just thinking. Alright, so now restricted polygon selections, of course that's where we want to drag this tag. Our surface texture channel needs to be our luminance. I think that's about all. We'll just give it a run through and just see what we've got. We just want to make sure that our grid resolution or our voxel size is back up to 5 just for testing. We don't want to blow ourselves out of the water with this crazy high res grid when we're just testing this. So now we can start this. But before we do, I just want to make mention to this here. What I've actually done with this, people have asked me about this before. What is this box? So it's just the simulation window, and then I've just docked it into this panel here. So we just undock it. Usually it floats around like this. You just grab these little dots here, drag it, and I put it in here. So whenever I'm doing simulations, it's really helpful to have this on hand, ready to go. So that's what it is. So for those people who wanted to know, let's just hit start. Now we can see that that's not working, and the reason why that's not working is because I didn't generate any UVW coordinates. Remember I mentioned that earlier. I was talking about how turbulence won't read the default projection methods in Cinema. You need to right click this and generate UVW coordinates. Now with a bit of luck, we should be able to play this through and have emission only happening from these bottom faces, which looks like that's exactly what's happening. So that's really good. Alright, so now what we can probably do is turn some of this stuff back on. So our hole, our top, we just want to make sure these pieces, or our emission pieces again, aren't on in the viewport and don't render. But we can turn our originals back on. And also our edge emit. For this particular render, we don't want to have that active. We're just doing element by element here, and this is of course the second one. So let's just give this a render and see. So we shouldn't really see a lot of activity until we get to the part where the pieces are sort of falling into the hole. We've got a little bit of stuff sort of coming up, and we're probably going to want to change some settings in the density and also add a collider to the actual top piece of our ground. So it's not really looking too flash. For the top, let's just add a turbulence FD emitter, and we'll set it to collision object, and in our container simulation we'll just turn off this temperature, we don't need it. For gravity, let's go something like 8 and give that a run through. This is why I thought it'd be easy to separate these into 2 elements. There's just too many different settings and it's just confusing if you try and do it all in one. So it's just best to manage these separately. So you can see now there's not really anything at all popping up, but it will look really cool once we get to the part where these things are caving in. We should have some nice volume of dust in the hole there, which it looks like we do. can see that there. Obviously there's not really much detail at all because our res is so low. But as we crank that up, again, things are going to compact down a bit and get thinner. So we can drop this down to say 3. So if you want to make this the smoke or dust thicker, of course you can control this thickness. You've got color controls here. And on the actual emission tag, which in this case is on the pieces emit, the more density or temperature or whatever you're emitting here you pump into it, the thicker it's going to get as well. So there's quite a few controls to tweak there if you want to make it thinner or thicker. Just run this through a little bit again and have a quick look. The great thing about this, if you do have a good GPU, is the speed. I really like being able to make quick changes to your simulations and get that almost instantaneous feedback. Just have a region render of that. So that's looking a lot better. So once again, go in and tweak these things and play around with them, but you've got the core emission set up, so you can't really do too much wrong. And don't forget to go into your container settings, drop your voxel size before you render it out, and all the stuff that I just explained in here is exactly the same for this. So once you've done that, those passes should be done. Then we can move on to the X particles setup.